Okay, so with my initial thoughts, the first thing I'm going to have to do anyway is pull all these little miscellaneous boards off and hit it with a coat of paint. So I'm going to do that now. That's going to be our first stage of this project. To remove all the previous boards from the walls of the closet, what I'm using is a hammer and a very small crowbar. As you've probably noticed, I've already put a hole in the drywall because old drywall does not hold up well to high amounts of force in a very small area. To avoid doing something like this on your own, I really recommend putting something like a putty knife, especially like a 6-inch putty knife, underneath the crowbar when you're prying, and that'll just distribute the force more evenly so you're less likely to punch through. Don't be afraid to take time doing this, because any damage you cause now is probably going to take more time to repair than the time you'd save by rushing. All of the boards that held up the old shelves and the old closet rod are now removed, and we have figured out a few things so far. First and foremost, we figured out that I have way too much faith in the strength of old drywall, and I broke it in 2 spots, so I'm gonna have to patch those. Next, we figured out that this is the level of terrible whoever made this closet was. They just have a straight up nail bridging the corner that I cannot get out. Third, we figured out that my gloves are absolutely disgusting and I should stop wearing them when I'm working on things that are white. Fourth, we figured out whoever did the paint previously on this did a terrible job. 1, because of how poorly coated the shelves were, and 2, because this is all completely unpainted underneath those boards. So now that everything is at least off of the walls except for the baseboard at the bottom and then the trim at the top, we have at least the ability to get to everything, get it cleaned off, and then I will get the first coat of paint on. But before I can do that, I gotta take off all these ridiculously high ridges from whoever botched this previous paint job, and also patch these holes that I put because I'm stupid. Although I gotta say, this side with the wood paneling actually held up really good. I was putting a decent amount of pressure on that and it really didn't move a whole lot. So that was actually kind of a welcome surprise. For an unpleasant surprise is, as you can tell by this armada of holes across the entire length of this back, whoever did this closet, and I have a strong suspicion it was the previous owner, they didn't even try to hit a stud. They just put nails in wherever. As a result, it made everything extremely hard to pull out while also adding almost no structural support whatsoever. Hat tip to you, previous owner. That was a not smart decision, but you know, I'm not really surprised given the fit and finish of other things, we'll say. Prior to getting anything painted, I really got to get those drywall holes patched for obvious reasons, so I'm going to get that done now. I'm going to do a separate video with a how-to on those, and that's going to be linked in the description below. All I'm using to wash these walls is some warm soapy water, a sponge, and then some paper towels to dry up any extra water. Right now the walls are partially clean. I know I said I was going to resume after I had the drywall already patched. However, it became very apparent that as I was scrubbing these ridges with the Scotch-Brite side of the sponge, these are not going to come off with just that abrasive edge of the sponge. So these will all have to be sanded, and as a result, it doesn't really make sense to go ahead and clean this whole thing knowing that I'm going to hit it with a sander and just dust up this whole area again. So I am going to get only these 2 spots patched, and then because those are also going to have to get sanded anyway, I'm just going to hit everything at once, and then I'll resume once I'm doing the sanding. So, take 2. As of now, I have the spackling on both sides for my drywall patches. However, I still got to sand down these edges, and I'm doing that in the other video. But I figured while I'm sanding those, I'm just going to plug in the orbital, crank out all these other ridges, and frankly, disgusting paint chunks on the rest of the wall too. There's really 2 options if you're doing something like this that you can use. The first is these sanding sponges, especially for drywall. These actually work really well. Or what I'm going to do is, like I said, I'm going to crank out the orbital. I'll be using about 150 grit. I don't want to go too much less than that. I would probably say like 120-ish is about the bottom end you should use. If you do more than that, you're going to start eating away into the drywall itself potentially, and obviously that is not a good thing. So this is going to generate a ton of dust. I've already opened up all my windows to try to ventilate this, but I'm still going to be wearing a respirator. Let's go ahead and get this over with. I'll touch more on this in the drywall video as well, but try to use circular motions around the edge of the patch. That way it blends in nicely with the rest of the wall. I also tested out this grit of sandpaper on the paint lumps, and I'll tell you how that works in a moment. My drywall patches are now sanded. However, I just tried to hit a little small sample spot with the 150 grit I was using on those. I was using the 150 grit because I needed the much more smooth transition on these to really kind of taper it into the wall line. However, these ridges are just so much bigger and so much worse that the 150 is not going to be quick enough to take it all off, and I really don't want to spend 12 hours sanding this one closet. So I'm going to go down to an 80 grit. It is the most coarse that I have / would ever really try to use on drywall. So I'm going to resume the video using that. Anytime you're using sandpaper, especially with an orbital sander, it's always a trade-off of how quickly you want to remove material with a coarse grit sandpaper versus how nice of a finished surface you want and how smooth you want it to be with a more fine grit sandpaper. As I said, I'm going with an 80 grit in this application right now, which is a fairly coarse sandpaper, and it doesn't come without its trade-offs, and I'll touch on those in just a moment. Sanding is now complete. As you can kind of tell, I'm trying to work the edges and make it a smooth transition top to bottom. Most of sanding drywall or spackle or mud, anything of that nature, is by feel. So even all this, where it still looks so rough, it's actually a very smooth transition. I mean, there's a couple small spots where I could probably go a little bit deeper, but because I was already starting to get through the actual drywall top layer, I really don't want to do that because this stuff gets pretty nasty pretty quick, and I don't really feel like replacing even more drywall this weekend. Like I said, this creates a crap load of dust, but at least it's done. I'm going to go ahead, wipe off all the dust from these walls, then I can get a coat of paint on here. Once again, I'm using soapy water with the sponge to wash off the walls, and you'll notice that I'm going from the top of the wall down to the bottom. If you start at the bottom and then work your way up, you have a chance of knocking dust farther down on the wall, and then you're going to have to clean the lower part again, so typically top to bottom is just the easiest. This closet will be ready for paint once those walls are dried off, but I'm going to wait until the next video to get that started. I want to thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you next time.